Hey, what's up, players and player haters? This is John Edward Willie. This is Circle 8. I am wondering, as I walk through this splendid, delicious lemon sunshine, walking through the perfume of air dryer lints, and to be honest, smelling the intoxicating smell of my own cologne, which I won't mention unless they're sponsoring me, but it is one of the more renowned classic colognes. And so I am sort of living in a sensorium, sort of living in a floating heaven of thinking, imagining, dreaming, and listening to music, which in many universally mysterious ways activates parts of my being that, like smelling, are extremely enjoyable. And I'm curious what it is that you love most that is unspeakable. You know, what is it that you sort of take the most pleasure in, that is most not dark for darkness sake or anything that's merely perverse for its own strange sense, although it does include that, but the kind of notions that are overlooked, the kind of particular things and themes and ideas and stories that can't be spoken about, you know, because it's paradoxical that we live in an age where anything can be said. You know, I mean, it's not that everybody believes that, but if you ask a lot of people, there's sort of an idea that with freedom of speech and with the proliferation of information, not only can anything be said, but that it's been said, right? That there's a sense in which there's almost nothing that remains unsayable. In other words, there's nothing taboo. There's nothing that we can't in public talk about, right? And so there's a lot of people that sort of see it as a political thing, and the sense in which they see that their political point of view isn't even silenced so much as it is negated before it's allowed to begin. In other words, silence itself can take on that multitude of forms that sort of makes one feel, at least, whether or not it's true, that there's a sort of narrative or a sort of like idea that is not allowed or permitted into public discourse, right? So I'm sort of hinting at all the different ways in which what is taboo, what is secret, can exist. And so in spite of the general belief that so much is out in the open and so much has been said, there are a lot of people that sort of feel like their point of view isn't allowed. And not only that, but that there is a lot more to be said, to be added in to public discourse. So I offer that as a sort of very general sort of introduction to what it is that I'm wanting to ask you about, which is, what is it that you find to be most exhilarating? And I'll cut to the chase. I find the sweetest unsaid notion to be twofold. I find that it has something to do with the political, right? In the sense in which there's something that is being suggested by both sides of the extreme, the political extreme on the left and the right. There's something important being said about, although freedom of speech being the case, it's ostensible insofar as there's many different ways in which other voices are silenced or misdirected or never allowed to bloom in the first place, right? And yet it also takes on another form, which is aesthetic, or in terms of art. And so I'll begin with a very negative, a very apparently negative, like it can appear to be bleak or negative, insofar as I begin with a sort of critique or recognition, not of a critique, but of a general consensus that there are no answers in regards to the very political kinds of questions that we have that warrant the kind of narratives that we imagine to have been broken by modernism, the kind of narratives and stories that are sort of increasingly unbelievable. You know, there's a sense in which one has to begin with the recognition that in science and in politics, no one no longer has an absolute idea in regards to an explanatory model. An explanatory model being something like a theory or an idea or an image within which we can work deductively back to the specifics of the moment and therefore explain it. That's something that is not only a part of the dream of all sciences and technologies. I mean, on a certain level, it's a utopian kind of dream, but it's increasingly discovered to be impossible. Not that it won't happen in the future. I mean, a lot of people say it will happen in the future, but that's not the case either. Because in fact, contrary to general belief, science increasingly discovers a world that is indescribable and that slips through our hands. And I'm not a relativist. You know, I'm not making the kind of argument that science is just the same as everything else, because it is a different kind of thing from everything else. But when you sort of burrow your way into its underlying basements, like the basements of the philosophy of science, you sort of discover the fact that in mathematics, we fail to discover a foundational relation between logic and rationality and math in a strict analytical sense. And in other words, we find that we are sort of floating or free floating on premises that can't be verified without pointing outside of the system itself. And again, I'm not a specialist, but I know enough about the mathematician Gödel or Gödel in regards to the incompleteness theorem, in regards to the general inability we have to say something about everything without having to break our own rules and speak from the outside. There's a really great text by a French philosopher named Jean Baudrillard, and it's called The Impossible Exchange. And of course, it will frustrate people who are analytically minded because it's written in the French style, and it's an impressionistic, bleak, cynical book. But The Impossible Exchange has to do with precisely this and the situation that we're in. I think Baudrillard is wrong, not in his conclusion, but in his very sensibility, you know, because what I discover is that this very beginning, this very wreckage, and wreckage is a part of the catastrophe of modernism. It's a catastrophe of life in America after the Civil War, life in Europe and the rest of the world after World War I, and the emergence of the Industrial Revolution. All of that is not simply a beautiful system, beautiful world being built on top of itself. I mean, everyone increasingly has the awareness that we're beginning with this sort of wreckage. And so we're also simultaneously striving to do what people do, which is to make sense of this wreckage and to pull ourselves together so that we can autonomously and creatively learn how to generate a response that is specific as the situation that we face. And I find that the only way that that makes sense is on a localized level. Now, of course, the idea of thinking locally or that politics is local, that has been taken over by a lot of theorists who really have no sense at which it does make sense to people, but it's brutally betrayed when it's spoken about in such a reductive way that gives away to ideology in terms of other people telling us how we're supposed to think about a localized politics, right? And by localized, one could think neighborhood, community, one can think family. You know, there's sort of a tension between the right and the left regarding family and community as being the basis within which to think about a localized political life, right? But I think that it's ultimately, again, something that warrants a pluralism that allows people to think about how this might work on their own. And for myself, I'm hyper vicious in regards to what I think of as all the false notions about community and about neighborhood in the political, in any sense that anyone thinks of it. And it's not because I'm bleak, it's because I'm honest. And because of this honesty, right, regarding the fact that I don't think that people can really form the kind of relationships without contracts or with contracts that we think we can form, because human nature tends to work against that, and we tend to have a hard time really accepting or beginning with our own human nature or other people's human nature. And that in itself requires a certain degree of perception that we take for granted, but is largely clearly not existent in the ideas that people have that are completely out of touch with how they even act or live their lives, you know? And I think that something has to be said for that, right? But it's not a bleak thing. It's not a negative thing. it's easily interpreted that way. But what it is a beginning point. You know, like if I'm not mistaken, like in regards to the Eightfold Path in Buddhism, the first of the Eightfold Truths is to begin with a clear view of reality. And it's been said that one specialist in Buddhism had said that the other 8 truths are irrelevant simply because they follow from the first. In other words, once you get a clear view of the wreckage, and by wreckage and catastrophe and brokenness and deconstructing, what I mean is that there is no longer a believable story that everyone is telling. And there's a difference between the beliefs that people show because they're continuing on their life, the shell of former lives when they did believe, and the actual beliefs that you discover, not if you're a journalist, but if you just go and talk to people, you discover that there's a severe distortion between what they will say on one level and what they are experiencing, because this breakdown is clear in the inner cities and it's very clear in the rural areas because they're all wrecked in many ways by the same kind of thing. And to not begin with that, to begin with a fantasy, right? To begin with an illusion about what is going on is a mistake. And of course, the mistake is also to believe in your own view so much that you become so self-satisfied that you're no longer thinking at all. Like, we are not interested in that. But I think that when we're thinking about thinking and not giving into theory or explanations on the one hand, but also not giving into like a reductive, sort of like cynical, like you give up kind of attitude, you know, that sort of dislocated, sadly very common point of view where you don't even think that you should think at all, that thinking is irrelevant. I mean, that's how things die, like in many ways. So I think that the practice of thinking as a modest activity in this regard is utterly crucial. And by modest, we don't mean conservative. What we mean is a kind of thinking that sees the body itself as localized. In other words, autonomy itself for every individual. And that is what I think we're raising children to be autonomous people. And you'll get annoyed if you listen to my videos because in a certain way, I use that word all the time. And it means something very important to me. And I will explain it more later. And I do think, however, though, that in regards to what I call the para-noir, which is my own word for the political, I think that this insistence is absolutely vital upon the specificity of your experience as a building block to what you think. In other words, if you can't begin with an affirmation of what you hear and see and feel, then you can't begin in any way at all. And like the sort of academic but also cynical driven skepticism of everything doesn't even allow the world itself in all of its fullness to begin for 1 second. And it's not that I'm trying to say anything ideological or politically oriented, but to resurrect the idea that when people are beginning with reality as a series of discrete options within which they are navigating and being pushed around and having a lot of pressure put on them, and that they can't exercise a modicum of existential choice within those options, there's nothing like the human being any longer existing on a certain level. You can say it's a Western conception of the human being, but there's a sense in which I begin with an affirmation of my own inherent inability to be otherwise than someone who believes in fighting for the truth, but also fighting in regards to the truth as it applies to you thinking about how you can think clearly without giving into superstitions or cynicism, and how you can think in a dignified way about the things that you simply cannot overcome, because we're all trapped on one level or another. But we're also, you might say, trapped by our inward human spirit to not be trapped. And I think there's nothing we love more than a good fight, like on a lot of levels. And so I think when you see that as animating the capacity you have to experience the world on a deeper level by fighting for whatever's left, fighting for whatever is there, you know, just fighting all the way down. Like, that's not about being, you know, an asshole or MMA type person. like love itself is like works in this way. You know, love itself is in many ways something that is sort of taboo in philosophy. So I didn't even think about it, but I haven't even gotten to what I wanted to speak about, but I am sort of making it clear. But there is something that's making itself clear as I speak, which is that love and sex and erotic desire and so many other things. If you study Western philosophy and literature, you find that in philosophy it's almost never discussed, in the sense in which it's seen as not being a part of rational discussions. And I think there's something to be said for the ways in which philosophy is attempting to speak without the emotive. It's attempting to speak in a way that wants to get at a particular kind of discovery that in itself is inherently helpful. But I think it's crucial to remember that it's not a critique of philosophy to say that philosophy has to be experienced and done in conjunction with life and living itself. And that's what it means to think and to live. And that means that the taboo in many ways is always there in the background of every generation, of every people. In philosophy, and being the way that it is, it offers a kind of toolkit. It offers a kind of set of options that are almost transcendent. They're not transcendental, but they're almost outside of time, in that the stuff that's going on at Plato and Aristotle and Kant and Hannah Arendt, you know, and Albert Camus, that stuff is for the ages. It really is for the ages, and it's immediately applicable to the urgency of our own lives, you know. And so there's something to be said for that inherent split between philosophy and life. But what I'm fighting for is to sort of thread, to sort of at least experience all of the inner space and estuaries between theory and being, between life and thinking, you know, between abstraction and the existential, you know, because I find that it's in this relational experience that life itself sort of opens up, not because life exists in these ideas or these words, but that life is its sort of own answer. It sort of answers the questions that we ask, just not in the way that our questions imagine they will be asked. In other words, there's a difference between understanding and experience. And there's a sense in which there's a difference between what is sort of knowing and what is understanding in philosophy. And I guess you could change those words. It's bad because they're easily interchangeable and misunderstood. But what I mean to say is that this is sort of fundamental to what I'm speaking about here, because this underlying thing is precisely what allows us to transition from a state of despair and dislocation over where we're at in regards to the collapse of narratives and stories. And that has to do with discovering the fact that you are precisely it, making sense of itself. And that when you allow these things to collapse in themselves as abstraction, as theory, life itself becomes resonant. Life itself makes itself known. And we find that the political, when we're not thinking, comes to take care of itself in an almost ambiguous way if it were not so imperceptible. And I think that the thing that is so crucial is the sort of flip that happens when you are able to see both of these things in the same way. And if you're listening, you can probably tell that I'm sort of getting so excited by so many notions at once that I'm almost losing track of my own thoughts. I find that a part of what is so exhilarating about these mental excursions that I take in these videos is that I am on a certain level attempting to mentally, without notes, without written words, keep a certain circular musical flow going. And I sort of set out before I begin a certain basic number of notions, a handful of notions, and then I seek to explore the connections between these in a way that isn't merely repetitive or boring or scripted, but is in many ways an attempt to allow myself to perform these ideas and to see what I can make of them. And so on a certain level, that also means losing myself in my thoughts. And I'm more than willing to put these recordings out there and include these own strange, sudden losses of thought and memory as being something that I include into my own nature, into my own personality. Because what I think is that when I speak to people, they will often sort of forget what they were going to say, as if like it were an error on a personal level. But I think it could be a wonderful opportunity to see that we're all forgetting something, like whenever we're thinking. You know what I mean? Like we might be talking to somebody and they can't remember a name, or even deeper than that, like what I just went through, you sort of forget completely or almost completely what you were saying. And although I made a video before about my boomerang theory, about how if you just relax, things do come back to you, like notions will come back to you. And that's part of what I enjoy about these videos, is that I practice like partially losing my thought, kind of like I'm wandering in a forest, and then I partially sort of find my way back, right? But I think that what I'm hinting at here is a deeper sense that we all have forgotten something. Like, that's what the sweetest taboo is to me. That we have fundamentally forgotten the fact that the stories that we're telling ourselves about science and politics don't make sense. And that's just the beginning of the flip that I'm trying to get at. And the flip is the discovery that we don't have to make sense of it, that this stuff will make sense of itself. And not only that, there's a beautiful sense that science in its own essence is inherently open, right? Science is not what even people like me tend to commonly think of it as, because that inherent openness means that it's able to operate precisely because it's not perpetuating automatically totalizing theories. And so it's not that. And within the strengths and ideals of liberal democracy, there's a sense in which it in itself is a political model that's similar to ideal scientific models, that it's inherently open, right? And so even for a radical on whatever side of the spectrum that you're on, left or right, to critique the system itself without seeing this is sort of utterly ridiculous, you know? And so I think that there's a sense in which we find ourselves coming back home with the discovery that life itself can make sense of itself. And the sweetness of this taboo is often one that's found by people who have lived through their pursuit of political or scientific, as I'm sort of trying to separate these things. They've pursued these ideals, they've pursued greatness, or they've pursued whatever, and it always falls apart. Like it always collapses. Like there's something inherently unstable about all things. But these are people who also, in many ways, they might meet a lover, right? Or they might start a family, or they might go on an adventure. And the sweetness of this taboo is that you sort of discover that you were wrong anyways about your ideas, that your narratives are wrong, your stories are wrong. And lo and behold, you suddenly have precisely what you want, precisely what you would desire right in front of your own eyes. And your life is amazing exactly as it is. Because this very destruction that you've gone through, this very catastrophe that you've gone to, has actually not taken apart the you that you really think is you, but it's taken apart the false you. It's taken apart the part of you that's not real. And that's always painful. And so there's a sense in which, that's what I was getting at earlier when I lost my train of thought, which is that there's a pain, there's a great difficulty that is made in discovering that life is incredibly beautiful and meaningful in itself. And a part of what is so wonderful about discovering that life itself increasingly makes less sense the more that we understand it, is discovering what I was trying to get at when I was losing my train of thought, which is that there's a big difference between what we know and we understand. And what we know is quite deep. And what I mean by knowing is tacit knowledge that we can't articulate. And working in bars and nightclubs for a long time, one thing I discovered is that there's a lot of stuff that people know and they've been through and they talk about. Sometimes it's after they've had a few drinks and they're having a cigarette, but there's a sense at which people who constantly talk and claim to understand things sort of understand nothing, right? So there's a sense in which there's a flip that's murky and hard to articulate, but it has to do with this switch between thinking of the worthiness of understanding in the abstract, totalizing, rational sense as being the aim of life. That's something that is easy to believe in because it's very seductive. And it appears that if you let go of it, if you let go of this narrative, that you're losing control, that you're losing yourself. And that's what makes it so painful to let go of. And yet the very pleasure, that I'm hinting at in it being a sweetness is the sudden revelatory experience that you've actually discovered the meaning of life. It's almost as if within each of us there's an inherent process. There's sort of an inherent discovery that we have to make in lieu of discovering our idols, discovering the falseness of our ideals, of our beliefs that we hold about ourselves, about what we're supposed to be and what we're supposed to do. And what you discover is that you already know quite a bit in terms of what you've experienced, but you've probably suppressed it or balkanized it within yourself because you've sort of taken for granted the idea that these other truths are more important, that these other truths are what you were after. Because I think what we discover is this miraculous feeling that like you are the center of a world that is being born into itself, that it's blooming. There's a sense in which there's nothing to be ashamed of. There's nothing to be guilty of. There's nothing that you've ever done that's wrong. And this doesn't mean that everything you've done is good or that you're a perfect angel, because one has to let go of that idea that you're a miracle or you're a snowflake or you're a special thing or that you're somehow separate from other things and unique, because seeking that is the same thing as experiencing this continual allowance of what is superstitious, of what is false and fake, which is strange because I'm simultaneously advocating free will and determinism, but I don't think it's really how it might appear, because I'm advocating a kind of determinism that allows for a certain kind of mercy, a mercy that you can take on yourself. Because when you think in a deterministic way about yourself and other people, you start thinking more clearly because you're not really judging about choices and options. And at the same time, one is exercising a choice in living. One is exercising a choice in action. And to not affirm our ability to make choices is to really betray and let go of the better parts of who you are as an individual person pursuing autonomy. And so for the philosophical nerds out there, like people that are familiar with what I mean when I say this, it will make sense, which is that liberal democracy and its attempt through the European Enlightenment to animate the individual ability to think creatively and rationally, and to be able to think in a way that animates in other people their ability to think freely, depends upon a particular philosophical model that comes out of René Descartes. And so René Descartes, who's a French philosopher writing in the 17th century, he in many ways lays out, he's like used partially because of how profound he is, but also because he's a good representative of somebody who perfectly articulated a style of consciousness that's fundamental to all of our lives, when we think about our individual ability to think clearly and to affirm our willpower, but also to affirm our ability to understand. You know, it's sort of at the heart of both sides of the left and the right. You know, it's just that they have completely different conceptions as to what it means. And what I'm getting at here is that this Cartesian subjectivity, which is what it is, they call it Cartesian subjectivity because it's a model of what human consciousness is. And it's also how I experience consciousness. I think that Descartes, in spite of everything I disagree with him about, and few people have disagreed with Descartes more than I have, I think that he's studied again and again in spite of how wrong he is, because of how clearly he articulates the consciousness of someone who is trying to get their life together, and someone who's trying to improve their world, and somebody that is trying to read literature and look at painting. There's a sense in which one becomes a subject and objectifies the world, because the critique of René Descartes by later philosophers is that he allowed us to start thinking of ourselves or he allowed the Christians to reconstitute themselves into a philosophy effectively that saw the human species as separate from the world around it. And if you've ever heard the phrase objectification, that sort of like is originally a way of critiquing Descartes in the way in which he objectified the world. But the very scientific revolutions, and what I'm getting at, the very political revolutions, the liberal revolutions of the 18th and 19th century, those are all critically dependent on Descartes, on his idea of like what subjectivity is, what the self is. And Descartes, in this sense, is affirming what is also an illusion from a philosophical point of view, which is many things. I mean, but the fundamental thing is free will. Like Descartes sort of believes in a certain amount of free will. And that in itself is a continuation of a tradition that begins with religion and not with philosophy. And the reason that Descartes has ultimately, in many ways, although he haunts philosophy, he's been written out of philosophy, although he is modern philosophy, it's because of this inherent inability we have to work his cogito into a cohesive, unified philosophy that can also allow us to make sense of protocol within science that demands that we let go of his premises. And so what I find, though, however, is that on a personal level, you're a fool to begin any other way than to begin with an inherent affirmation of your ability to think creatively and critically and to make sense of your own life. And again, I sort of have no idea how I started speaking about that, but I think that I was meaning to suggest that this idea in itself is a part of what makes the taboo so seductive. It's a part of what makes the discovery of secret unknowns, and in the sense in which you can discover that not only has your community lied to you, even though they have good intentions, but your teachers have lied to you, the institutions that shape your life have lied to you. And I don't mean lie in a bleak sense that they mean to hurt you, but on many levels there's no other option, and that's what civilization does. But what it does is it destroys individuals' like abilities to have mercy on themselves, to relax for a few seconds in order to think clearly. And you can't relax if you're like buying in completely to this idea that, and if this is a continuation of Descartes, and it's a limitation of Descartes' idea of free will, if you're constantly living in a state of tension and paranoia, and you're unable to relax, and you're unable to let go of the idea that you're guilty for not having control over your life, that you're guilty for not improving things, or that you're responsible for these big romantic, heroic gestures that in many ways is going to hurt other people, and in fact it's hurting your own ability to live a beautiful, dignified life in spite of all circumstances, you know, then you're sort of not allowing yourself to exist as you are, and that in itself is the very sweetness of seeing that human nature isn't as unified as we experience it, and it actually in fact involves a particular kind of modality, a particular kind of ability to shift between Descartes and other ways of thinking that allow us to relax and make sense of our lives. Because the thing that we have to discover if we're so cramped up, as I was just suggesting, so tensed up, is the sweet taboo, the sweet underlying truth, the thing that might be hidden to your community or your people, which is that it's not true, and that you are determined, and that there's nothing you can do. And it seems crazy to us that a person would even advocate that kind of like shadiness or shiftiness, but that's not at all what it is, because it's not like a duplicity. It's not like a kind of particular lying. What it is an activation of your underlying organic ability to think in very different ways according to very different experiences and situations. And I think that there's a really gross and superficially like abstract sense that a lot of people have in regards to like their own identity, and being unable to like make that kind of distinction between understanding and knowing, for instance, doesn't allow a person to relax into their creaturely self that can, in fact, as I had one boss once say, do what chefs do, which is to have spinning plates, to have many different plates going at once. Because to animate, to affirm the Cartesian subjectivity doesn't really mean to live inside of it, right? Because if you're sort of given up on life, or if you think that life isn't worth living, this sounds crazy, but Descartes in many ways could save your life. Like the thing in Descartes, and I keep using his name, but he's really just a representative of a lot of other things. But a part of what he's connected to is this idea that lit the world on fire, which is that you can understand things. Like you can exercise your ability to make rational sense, even if it's contingent and flimsy. It's like experimental. Like you can exercise your ability to make sense of your own life and your situation, and that can mean scientifically or politically, but it can also mean artistically, and that requires like an activation of a courage. That courage depends upon this belief. It's sort of coexistent with this belief that you can do it, and that's where Descartes can really bring to life, just like he has for hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people in many indirect ways, a very way of life that I'm as critical as anybody is, in the sense that, you know, I've rejected it all, in other words. And so I've come back around to a strange kind of radical humility in regards to our very way of life as a whole and what is required to sustain it on a daily basis. And not only that, but the underlying kind of beliefs and notions and ideas and philosophy and culture as a whole that sort of keep this thing going, sort of the imaginative machinery that makes our lives what they are. Because if you look around and you see all the actions that make people live the life that they do. Oh, hey, there's my friend Eric. What's up, bud? Speaking of interruptions, Eric is gonna hang out with me tonight. But yeah, I will I'll have to finish this video in the next video that I'll make tonight. Say something cool.
Hi. Taking pictures of people again.
yeah, I've been hanging out in the ladies' bathroom taking pictures of people, taking pictures of ladies up their skirts. Once again, players and player haters, this is a continuation or second part to the first video I'd made, the Sweetest Taboo, about those unsaid subjects that are simultaneously painful to recognize, in the sense in which the taboo, or the underlying truth, is that what we think makes sense does not make sense, and yet at the same time an underlying kind of organic order works its way through, nonetheless proving to us, contrary to what our expectations might have been, that there was in fact something always already on our side, meaning that the other underlying secret taboo, secret truth, is that life does make sense on its own terms. And so the splendid discovery includes the discovery that one's own self is an extraordinary thing to be, regardless of how you might have thought about yourself at other points in your life. That you yourself, as you are, in whatever case you are, whatever body or situation you're in, there's an element of miraculousness. There's an element of extraordinary surrealism, in the real thick sense of what surrealism can mean, as meaning the very magic of being alive. And of course, one can't sustain that thought. You can't keep that thought alive. And of course, that thought itself has to be killed, because it gives way to an inability to see precisely what it's trying to say. And that's why language, whether it's ancient or new, is always making itself anew in our language, because our language becomes vacuous and empty, and so we have to re-say and re-say again and again, each generation with each person, what precisely is meant by the miraculous. And that's where I begin, with the sense of the Sweetest Taboo being, in the more positive sense, the wonderful awakening to this realization. And you can see that you can't sustain it, right? You can't keep that thought alive, and it has to be kept alive again and again in language, as I'm saying. But the other thing that I'm saying is that it's dangerous, not only to other people, but it's dangerous to you to keep that recognition alive. And yet it's the very recognition that can save your life, which is that there is so much else that is going on. And the reason that it's called taboo isn't because of the obvious reasons, but because it could lead perhaps to a state of exultance that would make going to work nearly impossible. You know what I mean? Like, there's an extraordinary sense in which I keep telling myself I won't keep saying a sense in which, but maybe I will for a while. But there's a miraculous way in which one might awaken one day to discover the exultant in a modest form, one that includes the everyday people and things in your life exactly as it is, and you yourself exactly as you are. That's the other side of this, stepping through the painful thought that what you have been told or what you have thought might be wrong. And that's what is at the heart of the first video that I made in regards to the subject, the underlying discovery. And in lieu of that, and yet one has to have what used to be called kind of faith in the discovery that happens through experience and not through the transmission of understanding. You know, that's also at the heart of this, is that an underlying kind of knowing works itself through us, so that when we let go of our ideas, we're not merely replacing them with other ideas and other ideals. We're allowing life itself to speak on its own terms. And when life speaks on its own terms, it can tell us exactly what we're supposed to do and tell us what we're supposed to think, which sounds like a strange idea, especially if, you know, one isn't being religious or metaphysical about it. But imagining a path in life where people have to let go of their past general ideas and have the courage to create their own ideas, to create their own story. You know, it's almost bad taste. It's almost like indignant to not tell yourself your own story, especially if that means having taken apart all other stories and beginning with those fragments and working it into something. The sort of juice or fuel that drives that is the underlying realization and actual experience that life itself will make sense of itself and start putting itself together, because the you that you think exists doesn't have anything to do with this sort of life that's working its way through. And I think that that's necessarily taboo, because it's not only dangerous, but it's crucial. That's the last thing that I'll say in this video, is that it's crucial perhaps that it is taboo, that these things are secrets, and they're secrets within secrets within secrets, because even people telling truths have things that they can't say to themselves. And so the very discovery that it was crucial that you lied to yourself, or that you were lied to, or that you believed whatever falsehood or crazy story that you believed, was precisely so that you could individually have that experience of flipping and realizing how wrong you were, and therefore appreciating in the deepest sense the newfound discovery of a critical and creative life. I don't know, but I'm throwing that out there as my own expression of this dazzling sensation that isn't an idea, but it's a sensation and a feeling that is in many ways, to me, the unexpected experience of philosophy. It's a discovery of a very shift in my attitude and my disposition and my feeling in life. And it's sort of like the thing that I think is to be found in philosophy, and yet it almost can't be known ahead of time, because this kind of undoing includes a particular kind of fear that gives way to the flip, and that flip is when fear becomes this exuberant excitement, this realization that something is working itself out, you know, and that something is us. I'm John Edward Willie, and this is Circle 8, and I'm having a brilliant time making these videos. I know I have a lot of work to do, but I feel like I'm getting a little bit better and enjoying myself a little bit more with every video. So the more feedback you give me, no matter what it is, the better. I love you guys.